Hi everybody, it's David from Doctors of Running, and today we're going to be doing the review of the HOKA Cielo X1. This will be the new super shoe coming out from HOKA. They should keep the Rockered X line alive, but the Cielo X1 gives you a little bit of a different offering, and I will say the experience is a little bit different. So going into specifications before we begin, they actually do differ in stack height between the men model and the woman model. So men model, we're looking at 39 millimeters of stack in the heel, 32 millimeters of stack in the forefoot. So that's a 7 millimeter drop. So not that classic 5 from HOKA. Women's model still has a 7 millimeter drop, but we're looking at 37 millimeters of stack in the heel, 30 millimeters of stack in the forefoot. Going on the weights, now the weights might sound heavy, but they did change their sample size for the men's. So men's size 10, we're looking at 9.3 ounces and 264 grams. Women's size 8, we're looking at 7.4 ounces, 210 grams. Now, that still is a little bit on the heavier side, even for the women's size 8, but I don't think the shoe runs that way. I think we'll talk about it more in a second, but it's very responsive, very highly rockered. So if you like a ride that's really kind of rolling you forward constantly, this does provide that for you. When we take a look at the shoe on the inside, it does have a winged plate. So it's very wide through like the midfoot and forefoot where it kind of spoons out like this. And so you can see kind of the depth there, wide platform. It should fork out like this. And I would say it's very noticeable, very stiff. I mean, you try to bend this thing, it's not gonna happen. And it's a dual layer PIPA-based midsole. It does come across that way, very responsive, very bouncy. Upper construction that they wanted to know, gusseted tongue, and it's an asymmetrical lacing system meant to help lock things down. So from a tech sheet standpoint, that's kind of what that is. Going into my experience with this shoe, the upper does lock down really well. And it's actually interesting because I thought I'd have a harder time getting my foot in it, kind of like the previous Alpha Flies, but it goes in pretty easily. The knit upper here, it's a little bit warm. It does a tiny bit of stretch to it, but it actually holds its structure really well. And I think the fit through the heel, the midfoot, the forefoot, it's decently forgiving, but it locks down really well. And so there's definitely enough space for swelling accommodation, and it does. And if you want it to lock down like a track-like upper, you can make it do that. The lacing system, it feels a little bit plasticky. It takes a second to get used to and figure out, but once you have it and you lock it down, those laces are not going anywhere. So I did appreciate that. The tongue here is pretty stretchy. That didn't seem to be an issue. It didn't slide around. The gusset is in there pretty tight, and so it does hold to your foot pretty well. And I didn't really have any issues with biting from the laces, which was actually kind of surprising. I thought I'd have some. So overall, the upper construction is actually pretty comfortable. There is a heel counter in there. There's very minimal padding, but it's actually integrated really well. I didn't have any irritation there. And then there's a little bit of reinforcement on the inside just to keep your foot from sliding and doing some funny stuff. And I think it did a good job there as well. So I actually really liked the upper. Does run a little bit on the warm side, I will say. It could be a little bit more breathable, but otherwise I was quite happy with how it fit. The lacing was weird at first, but I got used to it. So that's the upper there. Going into midsole, geometry, responsiveness. This shoe certainly responds when you put some pressure into that midsole. So I found that at marathon paces, it feels really good. This shoe's meant to be kind of that 10K to marathon. I think you could still run a 5K in this shoe. I don't think it's a little bit on the heavier side for that, but I did run some mileage around that 5K, 10K-ish pace, and it seemed to do okay. Geometry, very rockered. So this is a shoe that you're kind of constantly in a rolling motion, but it has a very lively and bouncy forefoot, which is actually kind of surprising for how rounded that forefoot is. A lot of the shoes that have that kind of geometry, I feel like I'm kind of falling off the front, and it likes to be more in rhythm. But this is a shoe that I almost feel like I want to crash onto that shoe kind of hard and really explode off the forefoot. It almost like gives you a positive reinforcement for doing that. So the responsiveness is quite high. I think some of that might also be the outsole traction too. You feel kind of more connected than you do in some other shoes. One gripe I did have about it actually, ironically, is the lateral cutout. Now, I didn't have an issue with it when I was running on flatter grounds or not making turns, but I did notice whichever side you are laterally, if you are running on the left side of the road, going against traffic and there's a camber on the road, this part of the shoe has a tendency to almost invert you pretty quick. And so one of my workouts that we were doing was in a neighborhood where the roads are quite cambered, and we were running with traffic because you can't really see going against the left. But the turns, when you are kind of getting in tight on those turns, there is quite a little divot there. And I did kind of have a couple of quick motions there at my ankle that I would have rather not had, and I probably wouldn't have had in other shoes. With that said, as long as you're not on sharp cambers or you're making hard turns, the shoe does pretty well. Like sweeping turns, things like that. Like I think the traction does good enough. The outsole traction, upper lockdown, I think for the most part, those do a good enough job to where you can get around. There are definitely some sidewalls integrated as well. So in the heel and through the midfoot, and then you kind of get another larger one in the forefoot here. So you kind of have this little gentle guidance sensation the whole way, but this is definitely a shoe that I do feel competes with the other super shoes on the market. I don't think this is like a B tier shoe. I think someone could easily use this and have it as their favorite shoe. I think it just has to check a couple of boxes. And I think if you like that wider base and a really rockered ride, this shoe can do that. And I think if you have a little bit of a heavier foot strike and you really like to kind of use that ground and eat it up and like crash onto it and push off of it, this shoe likes to do that. Not all shoes like to do that, and they feel a little bit unstable doing it. But I do feel like the Cielo X1 does a good job of responding to that. Now, I will say the weight is a little bit heavier than some other shoes. If that's a consideration, then that's a consideration. But I don't feel like it hindered my ability to use this shoe in any way. So that's a good thing. But I will say it's a little bit heavier than some of the other shoes, including the Rockered X2. This shoe will be retailing at $275. I do see it kind of like that Alpha Fly competitor, Endorphin Elite competitor. That kind of class where it's like the high stack, kind of like premium, I guess you could say, racing shoe. But honestly, my experience in the Cielo X1 has been nothing but positive so far, outside of some of those divot motions. So I do think it would be nice if they filled that in a little bit better. And not have that cut out quite as large, because I do feel like that it did have a couple inversion moments that I would have liked to not have. But overall, really good experience. And those are my thoughts on the HOKA Cielo X1.